Right now, someone you love is sitting across from you, and you have no idea what it is like to be them. You know what they say. You know how their face moves when they say it. You know the pitch of their voice when they're lying, or you think you do, and you know the particular silence they fall into when something has hurt them. You have spent years, maybe decades, building a model of this person so detailed that you can predict their reactions before they have them. You can finish their sentences. You can tell from the set of their shoulders in a doorway whether tonight is a night to talk or a night to leave them alone. And none of that, not one particle of it, tells you whether there is anyone home in there at all. Think about the last time someone told you they were fine when you could tell, somehow, that they weren't. You read it in a pause that lasted half a second too long, in eyes that didn't quite match the smile, in a version of fine that didn't sound like their other fineness. You felt certain, in that moment, that you had glimpsed something real underneath the performance, some actual private weather system of sadness or fear or exhaustion that the words were failing to cover. But notice what you actually had access to. You had another layer of behavior, a different tone of voice, a different set of muscles in the face, another external signal, richer than the words but still, at bottom, exactly the same kind of thing, an outside. You never got underneath it. You never will. You only ever get more outside, stacked on more outside, and somewhere in that infinite regress you simply decide, the way you decide it every day without noticing, that this time you've reached the bottom, that this time you've actually touched what it's like to be them. This is not a thought experiment you're being invited to entertain for fun. This is the actual condition you are in right now, and have been in every moment of your life, and will be in until you die. You have never once, not for a single second, had direct access to another mind. Every person you have ever loved, argued with, envied, buried, could in principle be a puppet of extraordinary sophistication, mouthing the right words, producing the right tears, and experiencing absolutely nothing behind the performance. You cannot rule this out. Not for your mother. Not for your children. Not for the person you married. Think about how much of your life is built on top of this assumption without your ever examining it. Every apology you've ever meant, you meant it because you assumed there was someone on the other end capable of being hurt by what you'd done, and capable of being soothed by hearing you were sorry. Every time you've held someone while they cried, you weren't just performing a comforting gesture. You believe with total conviction that behind the crying was an actual experience of grief that your presence was somehow easing. Every law against cruelty, every hospital, every act of charity toward a stranger you'll never see again rests on the unexamined premise that there is somebody home behind the faces of other people, somebody capable of suffering and of relief from suffering, somebody for whom things can go better or worse, not just mechanically, but in a way that matters to them, from me inside. Pull that premise out, even provisionally, even just as a thought experiment, and watch how much of human civilization suddenly looks like it's floating. And here is the part that should actually keep you up at night. You can't even be sure you'd notice the difference. Because whatever is happening inside another person's skull, whatever redness they see when they look at a stop sign, whatever the pain feels like from the inside, whatever it is like in the full and total sense to be them, is sealed off from you by a wall that no microscope, no MRI, no future technology has ever crossed or shown any sign of being able to cross. You get behavior. You get reports. You get a face that winces and a mouth that says that hurt. You never get the hurt itself. You never get the thing the wince and the words are supposedly about. Philosophers have a name for this. They call it the problem of other minds, and it has been quietly sitting underneath the entire history of human thought like a fault line nobody wants to look at directly, because looking at it directly tends to produce a very specific kind of vertigo. It is the vertigo of realizing that the most basic assumption you make about the world, the assumption that other people are experiencing anything at all, has never been proven. Not once. Not by anyone. It is not even clear what proof would look like. So let's actually do this. Let's go looking for the proof. Let's follow the argument all the way down, through solipsism and skepticism, through a strange man imagining a strange beetle in a strange box, through zombies that aren't the kind in movies, through bats and colors and machines that are starting to talk back to us in ways that make the whole question feel less academic than it used to. By the end, you are not going to have an answer. Nobody has an answer. What you're going to have is a much clearer picture of exactly how deep the hole goes, and why the fact that we all keep believing in each other anyway might be the strangest and most important thing about being human at all. Let's start where the doubt starts. Let's start with a man alone in a room, trying to burn everything down. In the winter of 1619, a young French soldier named René Descartes shut himself in a small, stove-heated room somewhere in Bavaria and decided to see how much of what he believed could survive being doubted. Not doubted a little, doubted completely. He wanted to find one thing, just one, that was so certain that no possible deception, no matter how powerful, could shake it loose. And so he built, in his mind, the most thorough demolition project in the history of Western philosophy. He started with the senses because the senses seemed like the most obvious place to trust. But he noticed that his senses had deceived him before. A tower that looks round from a distance turns out, up close, to be square. An ore half submerged in water looks bent, though it is straight. If the senses have lied even once, Descartes reasoned, they cannot be trusted as an unshakable foundation, because a source that lies sometimes cannot be relied upon to tell you when it's lying. Then he went further. He considered the possibility that he might be dreaming right now, that everything he took to be solid, waking reality, the fire in front of him, the paper in his hands, the sensation of his own body sitting in a chair, might in fact be nothing more than the private theatre of sleep. He had had dreams before that felt completely real while he was having them. What separated this moment, this apparently waking moment, from a very convincing dream? He could find no reliable mark, which meant that even the existence of his own body, of the physical world entire, was suddenly up for grabs. And then, in the most famous and most radical move of the whole exercise, he imagined something worse than a dream. He imagined a being of immense power and immense cunning, what he called an evil genius, or in some translations a malicious demon, whose entire purpose was to deceive him about everything all the time, with total success. Not just fooling him about towers and oars, fooling him about the sky, the earth, colors, shapes, sounds, and every other external thing, fooling him about mathematics itself, making 2 + 2 feel like it equals 4 when it doesn't, feeding him a complete, seamless, undetectable simulation of a world that might not exist at all. Sit with how extreme this is. Descartes wasn't asking what if I'm sometimes wrong. He was asking what if I am wrong about literally everything, all the time, by design, and there is no possible experiment I could run from inside my own mind that would reveal it. He had constructed 3.5 centuries before anyone had a word for it, the philosophical scaffolding underneath every brain in that scenario, every simulation hypothesis, every what if none of this is real spiral that has ever kept a person staring at their bedroom ceiling at 3 in the morning. Descartes did not invent doubt from nothing. Nearly 2,000 years earlier, a Greek philosopher named Pythagoras, and the long tradition of skeptics who followed him, had already argued that certainty about the external world was essentially unreachable, that for every argument in favor of a belief, an equally forceful argument could be constructed against it, and that the wise response was to suspend judgment entirely rather than commit to conclusions the evidence couldn't actually support. The Platonists weren't primarily worried about other minds specifically, they were worried about knowledge in general, about whether the senses or reason could ever deliver truths solid enough to build a life on. But the basic move, doubting everything that seemed obvious until you found something that genuinely couldn't be doubted, or concluding that nothing could, was already sitting in Western philosophy centuries before Descartes picked it up, sharpened it into something far more systematic, and pointed it, for the first time with real precision, directly at the question of what a single thinking mind can actually be sure of. And here is where it gets interesting, because Descartes did, eventually, find his flaw. He found the one thing the demon couldn't touch. Even if the demon was deceiving him about everything else, the demon could not deceive him about the fact that he was being deceived, because being deceived requires a deceived party. Something has to be there to be fooled. Descartes wrote it down in a sentence that has outlived almost everything else he ever said: I think, therefore I am. Cogito, ergo sum. Whatever else might be an illusion, the fact of his own thinking in this very moment could not be. He could doubt the world. He could doubt his body. He could not doubt the doubting itself, because the doubting was proof that a doubter existed. It is, on its own terms, a genuinely airtight little island of certainty. The problem that Descartes himself seemed almost not to notice, or at least didn't dwell on nearly as long as the situation warranted, is what that island actually contains. It contains exactly one inhabitant. It contains him. It does not contain his body, which he has already thrown into the sea of doubt. It does not contain the external world, still submerged. And it absolutely, positively, does not contain other people. The cogito proves that a mind exists doing the thinking. It proves nothing whatsoever about any other mind. This is the moment solipsism stops being a fringe idea and starts looking like the logical endpoint of taking Descartes completely seriously. Solipsism, from the Latin solus, alone, and ips, self, is the position that the only thing you can be certain exists is your own mind. Everything else, other people included, might be nothing more than furniture in a dream you are having, or content generated by that demon, or, in a more modern and uncomfortably plausible dressing, a simulation running on hardware you'll never see. The solipsist isn't necessarily claiming that other people definitely don't exist. The honest solipsist is making a much narrower and much harder to refute claim that there is no way, even in principle, to know that they do. Descartes himself did not want to end up here. He was, whatever else he was, a devout man, and the entire architecture of his philosophy was built to eventually climb back out of the pit he dug, using the existence of a non-deceiving God as the ladder. If God exists and is not a deceiver, Descartes argued, then God would not allow humanity to be systematically wrong about the existence of the external world, and so the world, and the other minds in it, can be trusted after all. It is, by most modern philosophical standards, a weak link in an otherwise ferociously rigorous chain, and later thinkers picked at it mercilessly. But notice what that weak link tells you. It tells you that even Descartes, the man who invented modern skepticism, needed to reach for something outside pure reason, something closer to faith, to get from I know my own mind exists to I know other minds exist too. He couldn't get there on logic alone. Nobody, in the 400 years since, has managed it either. That is the real inheritance Descartes left us, whether he intended to or not. Not just a method of doubt, but a permanent, structural gap between the one mind you have direct access to and every other mind you will spend your entire life surrounded by, loved by, hurt by, and never once actually enter. If Descartes lit the fuse, the philosophers who came after him spent the next several centuries trying to diffuse it, and the most influential attempt came from a very different kind of thinker, John Stuart Mill, the 19th century British philosopher better known for his work on liberty and utilitarian ethics, who took a break from moral philosophy long enough to propose what has become the standard common-sense answer to the problem of other minds. It's called the argument from analogy, and it goes roughly like this. I know, from the inside, that when I am in a certain kind of physical state, when I stub my toe, say, or touch something hot, I experience pain, and that pain reliably produces certain behaviors in me. I wince, I cry out, I pull my hand away, I nurse the injury. Mill said, I look around and I see other creatures, other human beings, whose bodies are built more or less like mine, whose nervous systems function more or less like mine as far as anatomy can tell, and when their bodies undergo similar damage, they produce the exact same behaviors. They wince. They cry out. They pull away. Given that I know my own pain causes my own pain behavior, the most reasonable explanation for their matching behavior is that they have a matching cause. They, too, are in pain. I infer their inner states from the resemblance between their outsides and mine. It's an intuitive argument. It's the argument, more or less, that every one of us runs unconsciously 1,000 times a day without ever putting it into words. Somebody flinches, you assume they're hurt. Somebody laughs, you assume they're amused. You are constantly reading behavior and inferring interior states behind it because the alternative, treating everyone around you as a total mystery box, is not something a human mind is built to do, and honestly not something you could function for 5 minutes doing anyway. But look at what the argument actually rests on, because once you see the seam, you can't unsee it. Mill's inference is built from a single case, his own. He has exactly one data point where he can independently confirm both the physical state and the inner experience together, and that data point is himself. From that single case, he is generalizing to every other human being who has ever lived. Imagine a scientist who ran an experiment exactly once, got one result, and then confidently published a universal law based on that single trial. In any other domain, we would call that bad science. We would call it a wildly insufficient sample size. And yet this is the entire evidential foundation most of us are standing on when we assume that other people are conscious. One trial. Ourselves. There's a deeper problem lurking underneath the sample size issue too. The argument from analogy assumes that similarity of physical structure and behavior is a reliable guide to similarity of inner experience. But we don't actually have an independent way of testing that assumption, because testing it would require us to check the inner experience directly, which is precisely the thing we can't do. We're using the resemblance to infer the very thing that would let us verify the resemblance is meaningful in the first place. It's not quite circular, but it's uncomfortably close to it, a kind of epistemic loop where the only justification for trusting the method is the method itself. And the argument gets shakier the further you move from yourself. It seems reasonably safe applied to other humans whose bodies and brains are structurally almost identical to your own. Apply it to a dog and it gets a little weaker because the nervous system is recognizably similar but not identical, and behavior maps onto ours imperfectly. A dog's yelp seems close enough to a human cry that most people extend the inference without much hesitation, but already you're stretching the analogy across a gap. Apply it to an octopus, a creature whose nervous system is so alien that a significant portion of its neurons live in its arms rather than its central brain, and the analogy is stretched almost to breaking, even though most people who have watched an octopus solve a puzzle or recoil from a threat come away utterly convinced there's someone in there experiencing something. Apply it to an insect, and people start disagreeing sharply. Apply it to a plant that closes its leaves when touched, or a thermostat that responds to temperature, and almost everyone says the analogy has snapped entirely. But here's the uncomfortable question Mill's framework forces on you: where, exactly, does it snap, and why there? You didn't derive that cut-off point from any principled test of consciousness, because no such test exists. You derived it from a gut feeling about how much a given creature resembles you physically and behaviorally, which means your entire confidence that other humans are conscious and your entire confidence that thermostats are not is running on the same underlying machinery, a resemblance-based intuition dressed up as an inference, extrapolated from a sample size of exactly 1. This is not a small crack in the foundation. This is the whole problem of other minds compressed into a single, quietly devastating observation. You believe other people are conscious not because you've proven it, but because they remind you enough of yourself that the alternative feels psychologically unbearable. That doesn't make the belief wrong. It almost certainly isn't wrong in any practical sense you ever need to act on. But it does mean the belief is doing an enormous amount of unexamined work, holding up your entire moral universe, your entire capacity for love and grief and connection, on a foundation that, examined coldly, is closer to faith than to proof. Developmental psychologists have actually watched this capacity build itself piece by piece inside growing children, and the process turns out to be far more fragile and far more learned than most adults assume, which only reinforces how much weight Mill's shaky analogy is quietly carrying. Very young children, it turns out, do not automatically understand that other people can hold beliefs different from their own, let alone false ones. The classic demonstration is called the false belief task, most famously staged as the Sally-Ann test. A child watches a puppet named Sally place a marble in a basket and then leave the room. While Sally is gone, a second puppet, Ann, moves the marble into a box. The child is then asked where Sally will look for her marble when she returns. Children younger than about 4 years old overwhelmingly answer that Sally will look in the box where the marble actually is, apparently unable to separate what they themselves know from what Sally could possibly know, because Sally wasn't there to see the marble get moved. Somewhere around the age of 4, something shifts, often fairly abruptly, and children begin passing the test reliably, correctly predicting that Sally will look in the basket, acting on a belief they know to be false, because they have finally developed what psychologists call theory of mind, the working ability to represent that other people have their own separate, sometimes mistaken, mental states distinct from your own. This matters enormously for the problem of other minds, because it means the very faculty you're using right now to assume the people around you have inner lives is not a direct perception, not some faculty that simply switches on and reveals the truth, but a constructed cognitive model, assembled gradually in early childhood, refined over years, and, crucially, capable of developing differently or incompletely. Researchers studying autism spectrum conditions have spent decades investigating the idea that certain difficulties with social interaction may be connected to differences in how, or how easily, this theory of mind modeling develops, a hypothesis that remains actively debated and almost certainly incomplete as a full explanation, but that at minimum demonstrates something important on its own, that mind attribution is a skill built by a brain with a developmental timeline capable of manifesting differently across different people, not a transparent window that simply opens onto the fact of other minds the moment a person is born. You did not always believe other people had thoughts different from your own. You learned to model that possibility the same way you learned language, and the model you're running right now, the one telling you with such total confidence that the person next to you is thinking and feeling something, is doing exactly what Mill's argument does and exactly what it has always done, inferring, extrapolating, guessing based on patterns dressed up by decades of practice to feel indistinguishable from direct perception. Which brings us more than 2 centuries after Mill's argument to a strange, brilliant, and profoundly uncomfortable Austrian philosopher who decided the whole question had been asked backward from the start. Ludwig Wittgenstein spent the first half of his philosophical career believing that language worked something like a set of precise labels attached to things in the world, and he spent the second half of his career systematically dismantling that belief brick by brick in a series of notes eventually published as philosophical investigations. Somewhere in the middle of that book, in a short, almost throwaway-looking passage, he set up one of the strangest and most quietly terrifying thought experiments in the history of philosophy. It has come to be known as the Beetle in the box. Here's the setup in Wittgenstein's own framing, adapted slightly. Suppose everyone has a small box, and inside that box is something we call a beetle. No one can ever look inside anyone else's box. Everyone only ever looks inside their own. Everyone describes what they see in their box using the word beetle, and everyone agrees to use that word the same way. Now, Wittgenstein asks what happens if the thing inside each person's box is different for every single person. What if what's inside your box is something entirely unlike what's inside mine? What if some people's boxes are even empty? His answer is the part that should make the hair on your arm stand up. He says the word beetle would still function perfectly well in the language, even under those conditions. It would still mean something, would still let people communicate, would still get used correctly in sentences, would still let everyone say I have a beetle and be understood precisely because the actual content of the box, whatever is really in there, or whether anything is in there at all, has dropped out of the picture as completely irrelevant to how the word functions. The word beetle doesn't refer to the private thing in the box. It refers to a shared, public role the word plays in a shared, public language game. The private object, if it even is an object, cancels out of the equation, like a variable that appears on both sides of an equation and can be eliminated without changing the result. Now replace the word beetle with the word pain. Replace the box with your skull. Wittgenstein's actual target in this passage was the concept of pain, and by extension every inner mental state we describe with everyday language, and the implication is staggering once you let it land. When you say I'm in pain, and I say I understand, I've felt pain too, we are not necessarily comparing the same private experience at all. We might never be doing that. We might simply both have learned, as children, to attach the word pain to certain public triggers, injuries, certain public behaviors, wincing, certain public contexts, and the word does its job in the conversation, coordinates our actions, lets you ask for sympathy and lets me offer it without either of us ever needing to confirm that the raw felt quality behind the word is remotely the same for both of us. It might be. It might not be. The language has no way of telling, and worse, according to Wittgenstein, the language was never designed to tell because it was built entirely out of public, shared, third-person observable materials, behavior, context, consequence. This is, in a strange way, an even bleaker version of the problem of other minds than Descartes ever produced, because Descartes at least assumed the words were pointing at something, some private mental fact, that we simply couldn't verify. Wittgenstein is suggesting something stranger, that the very question does your pain feel like my pain might be malformed from the start, might be a question that sounds meaningful only because we've smuggled in the assumption that words like pain refer to private inner objects in the first place, an assumption Wittgenstein thought the entire history of philosophy had made without ever examining it. Some readers of Wittgenstein take this as a kind of relief. If the question is your inner experience the same as mine is confused or meaningless, then maybe there's nothing to worry about after all. Maybe the whole problem of other minds dissolves rather than needing to be solved, the way certain scientific questions turn out to be based on false premises and simply stop being asked once the premise is corrected. Other readers, and honestly this is where the thought experiment tends to actually sit once you let it fully sink in, find this deeply unsatisfying, even worse than the original problem, because it suggests that not only can you never confirm what's in another person's box, the entire practice of talking about what's in the box might be a kind of elaborate social performance built on top of a void, a performance so seamless and so useful that nobody ever notices there might be nothing underneath it that needs to match up between any two people at all. Think about what that means for your actual life, for actual relationships. Every time you've said I know exactly how you feel, every time someone has said it back to you, every time two people have bonded over a shared grief, a shared joy, a shared me too, you have been using a set of words whose entire function, according to Wittgenstein, could be fully explained without any of you ever having anything resembling a matching inner state. The words worked. The comfort was real, or at least the comfort behavior was real. Whether the Beatles matched was never something the conversation could possibly have checked. It's worth being precise about why Wittgenstein thought this, because it's easy to hear the Beetle example and assume he's simply asserting, without argument, that private experience doesn't matter. That's not quite what's happening. The Beetle passage sits inside a longer, more rigorous line of reasoning philosophers now call the private language argument, and the core of it is a question about how any word could ever get its meaning fixed in the first place if the only thing anchoring it was a private inner sensation accessible to just one person. Think about how you actually learned the word pain as a child. Nobody pointed at your private inner sensation and said that's called pain because nobody else could see your private inner sensation to point at it in the first place. What actually happened is that you cried or winced or pulled your hand back from something hot in a public observable situation, a scraped knee, a slammed finger, and the adults around you supplied the word pain in response to that public situation and that public behavior. The word was taught and learned entirely through outward, shareable cues. Wittgenstein's challenge is this: if that's the only mechanism by which the word could have been taught to you, what possible guarantee do you have that the word, once learned, is tracking a consistent private sensation at all, rather than simply tracking the public situations and behaviors it was originally paired with? He argues there's no way to set up a private checking procedure, no way to look back at your own past use of the word and confirm you're applying it correctly to the same inner thing each time, because checking requires an independent standard to check against, and for a purely private sensation, there is no such independent standard available, not even to you. You just be trusting your own memory of what you meant last time, with nothing external to verify that memory, against which Wittgenstein thought was really no check at all, closer to simply seeming right to you than actually being right. This is a genuinely radical claim, and not everyone in philosophy has accepted it. Critics have pointed out that Wittgenstein's argument, taken to its extreme, seems to threaten the very idea of an inner life doing any explanatory work at all, which strikes many people as going too far, throwing out something real and important, the undeniable fact that pain actually hurts, in the process of making a valid point about how language functions. Some philosophers have tried to find a middle path, arguing that Wittgenstein is right that public criteria are essential for word learning and for the possibility of communication, but wrong, or at least overreaching, if he's taken to be denying that there's a private, felt dimension sitting behind those public criteria that the words are, however imperfectly, gesturing toward. But even the philosophers most resistant to Wittgenstein's full conclusion tend to concede the narrower and still deeply uncomfortable point that language alone, the only tool you have for finding out what's happening inside another person, was built from the ground up out of public materials and was never actually designed or perhaps even capable of confirming a private match between speakers. The Beetle stays sealed. The word Beetle gets used correctly regardless. And if that unsettles you, hold on, because Wittgenstein's Beetle was only clearing the ground for an even sharper instrument that a philosopher working nearly a century later would use to try to cut straight to the heart of the matter, an instrument built not out of language but out of pure logical possibility. It's time to talk about zombies. Not the kind that eat brains. The kind that might not have one working the way you assume yours does and yet would fool you completely. In 1996, the Australian philosopher David Chalmers published a book called The Conscious Mind, and in it he introduced, or rather formalized and sharpened into a precision instrument, a thought experiment that has become one of the single most argued about ideas in contemporary philosophy of mind: the philosophical zombie, or P-zombie for short. Here's the definition, and it's worth sitting with slowly, because the whole force of the argument depends on taking it completely literally. A philosophical zombie is a hypothetical being that is physically, chemically, neurologically, behaviorally identical to a normal conscious human being in every single measurable respect, down to the last synapse and the last twitch of a facial muscle, but that has no conscious experience whatsoever. No inner life. No felt quality to anything. When you stub your toe, there is something it is like to be you in that moment, a flash of unpleasant sensation, redness, sharpness, whatever word you want to reach for that still falls short of the thing itself. The pea zombie stubs its identical toe, its identical nervous system fires in an identical pattern, it produces an identical wince and an identical cry of "oh, that hurt," and there is nothing it is like to be it at all. The lights, to use the common shorthand, are off. Nobody's home. And crucially, from the outside, you would have absolutely no way of telling the difference. Not with a brain scan. Not with a lie detector. Not with 100 years of conversation. The zombie would ace every test, pass every interview, cry at every funeral, and there would be nothing there experiencing any of it. Chalmers isn't claiming pea zombies actually exist. He's not saying your neighbor might secretly be one. What he's claiming is something more subtle and, in a way, more disturbing, that pea zombies are conceivable, that you can coherently imagine one without contradiction, and that this conceivability tells us something important about the nature of consciousness itself. Here's the logical move, laid out plainly. If you can conceive of a being physically identical to a conscious human but lacking consciousness without running into any logical contradiction, then consciousness cannot be reducible to physical facts alone. If consciousness were nothing more than a particular pattern of neurons firing, then it would be a contradiction to imagine all those neurons firing in exactly that pattern while consciousness is absent, the same way it would be a contradiction to imagine water that isn't H2O, because water simply is H2O, full stop, no further gap. But Chalmers argues that imagining a pea zombie produces no such contradiction. We can picture it clearly, coherently, without our minds rebelling against an impossibility. And if that's true, then whatever consciousness is, it's not merely identical to the physical processes that accompany it. There's an extra fact, something over and above the physics, and that extra fact is exactly the thing we can never observe from outside a system, only, at best, infer. This argument has a name that sounds almost too dramatic for academic philosophy and yet has stuck precisely because it isn't overstated: the hard problem of consciousness, a phrase Chalmers coined a few years before the pea zombie thought experiment to distinguish it from what he called the easy problems. The easy problems of consciousness, and Chalmers is being somewhat sarcastic calling them easy since they remain formidably difficult in their own right, are things like explaining how the brain processes visual information, how it integrates sensory input, how it produces reports about its own internal states, how attention works, how memory works. These are hard, but they're the ordinary kind of hard. The kind that more neuroscience and more computational modeling will eventually crack, because they are fundamentally questions about function, about what a system does and how it does it. The hard problem is different in kind, not just in degree. The hard problem is, why is any of that processing accompanied by experience at all? Why isn't all of it happening in the dark, functionally identical, information flowing in, behavior flowing out, but with nobody home to feel any of it, the way it presumably happens in your laptop right now as it processes this very sentence? You could, in principle, explain every single function the brain performs, every input-output relationship, every mechanism, in exhaustive physical detail, and still be left with the question dangling, unanswered, seemingly unanswerable even in principle: why does it feel like something to be the system doing all that? That gap between the complete functional story and the felt story is the hard problem, and the pea zombie thought experiment is Chalmers's way of making the gap impossible to ignore by showing that you can imagine the functional story running to completion with the felt story simply absent. Now here's where the thought experiment stops being an abstract puzzle for seminar rooms and starts pointing directly back at the terror we opened with. If pea zombies are even conceivable, if there is no contradiction in imagining a being that talks, laughs, cries, argues, falls in love, writes poetry about heartbreak, and has absolutely nothing going on inside, no felt experience accompanying any of it, then the argument from analogy that Mill offered us, the argument that got you through your entire life assuming other people have inner lives because they look and act like you, is revealed to be resting on an assumption that isn't even guaranteed by physical identity, let alone mere behavioral resemblance. Even a perfect physical duplicate of a human being, atom for atom, might not be conscious. Which means the actual human beings around you who merely resemble you, who share your general anatomy but not your exact neural firing patterns in any given moment, could be conscious or could not be, and the zombie thought experiment gives you no tool, none whatsoever, for telling the difference, because the entire point of the thought experiment is that there is no measurable difference to find. Not every philosopher accepts this argument, and it's worth being honest about that, because the p-zombie debate is one of the most contested territories in the entire field. Some philosophers, functionalists especially, argue that Chalmers's conceivability claim is simply mistaken, that once you really understand what it would mean for something to be physically identical to a conscious being down to every last detail, you'd realize consciousness has to come along for the ride, that the apparent conceivability of a zombie is an illusion produced by not thinking the scenario through carefully enough, the same way early thinkers might have thought they could conceive of water that wasn't H2O before they understood the chemistry, only to realize the moment they truly grasped the identity, the alternative became unimaginable, not just false. Daniel Dennett, one of the most prominent voices in this camp, has gone so far as to argue that p-zombies are not just non-existent but strictly inconceivable once properly analyzed, that anyone who thinks they can coherently picture one hasn't actually followed the concept all the way through. Dennett's specific objection is worth walking through because it's sharper than simply saying I disagree. He argues that what people are actually doing when they claim to conceive of a p-zombie is imagining something much shallower than the thought experiment requires, a being that looks and acts like a person from a comfortable outside distance, while quietly, unconsciously, failing to imagine the full, literal, down to the last detail physical and functional duplication the thought experiment actually demands. If you really committed to imagining a being with a brain functioning in every respect identically to a conscious human's, the same information integration, the same self-monitoring processes, the same internal representations of its own states feeding back into its own behavior exactly as they do in you, Dennett argues you would find yourself, on reflection, unable to also imagine subtracting consciousness from the picture, because consciousness, on his view, simply is that total pattern of functional self-representation, not some separate ingredient stacked on top of it. What feels like a coherent act of imagination, he suggests, is really more like imagining a barber who shaves every man who doesn't shave himself, and only himself, a scenario that sounds fine in a single sentence but quietly contains a contradiction the moment you try to work out its details in full. Dennett called the intuition that zombies are obviously conceivable a zombic hunch, a phrase meant half seriously to suggest that our confidence here is closer to a stubborn gut feeling than to a carefully verified logical possibility. Chalmers and other defenders of the zombie argument respond that this gets the burden of proof backward. It's not enough, they argue, to assert that full imagination would reveal a hidden contradiction. The burden is on the critic to actually locate the contradiction, the way you can locate the contradiction in a four-sided triangle the moment someone points it out to you, and no one, in several decades of intense arguments, has managed to produce anything like that for the zombie case. The debate, at this point, has effectively stalled into two camps with fundamentally different starting intuitions about what physical facts can and cannot entail, and it's stalled there for long enough among philosophers who are not stupid and not being careless that the disagreement itself has become a kind of data point, evidence that whatever is going on with consciousness, it resists the sort of definitional and logical resolution that settles most other philosophical disputes eventually. That stalemate is not a footnote to the problem of other minds. It is, in a real sense, the problem of other minds restated at the highest level of technical precision philosophy currently has available, and it remains exactly as unresolved as the question Descartes left dangling by his stove 400 years earlier. But even the philosophers who reject Chalmers's specific conclusion tend to agree that the thought experiment successfully identifies something real and unsettling, an explanatory gap between physical description and subjective experience that our current science simply has no tools to close. Whether or not zombies are logically possible, the fact that intelligent, careful thinkers can disagree so fundamentally about whether they are possible tells you something about how poorly understood consciousness remains and how little our confidence in other people's inner lives is actually backed by anything more solid than the deep, evolutionarily hardwired, psychologically necessary assumption that things which look like us on the inside as well as the outside. And it's not just whether other minds exist that's at stake here. Even if you grant generously, charitably, that the people around you are conscious, that the lights are on, there remains a second, deeper layer to the problem, a question not of whether but of what. What is it actually like in there? Is your red the same as my red? This is where we need to talk about qualia and about a bat. Qualia is the technical term philosophers use for the raw, subjective, felt qualities of experience, the redness of red, the specific unpleasantness of pain, the particular flavor of cinnamon, the exact quality of the sound middle C makes when a piano plays it. Qualia are, by most definitions, private, ineffable, and directly knowable only through having them yourself. You cannot describe the color red to someone who has never seen it in a way that would actually give them the experience. You can only give them associations, wavelengths, comparisons to other things, none of which is the redness itself. And this raises one of the oldest, simplest, and most surprisingly resistant puzzles in the philosophy of perception, sometimes called the inverted spectrum problem or the inverted qualia problem, which philosophers as far back as John Locke were quietly circling. Here's the setup. Suppose that when you look at a ripe tomato, the color you experience internally, the actual qual, the felt redness, is what I would call, if I could somehow see through your eyes, green. And suppose that when I look at that same tomato, I experience what you would call, if you could see through my eyes, red. But here's the catch: from birth, both of us have consistently called the color of tomatoes red. We were taught the word the same way, pointed at the same objects. My internal experience, whatever it actually is, has always been paired with the word red when I looked at tomatoes, fire trucks, stop signs, and your internal experience, whatever it actually is, entirely different from mine in its raw felt quality, has also always been paired with the word red for those same objects, because that's the word everyone around you used to. If our color experiences are systematically and consistently inverted relative to each other, but we've each independently learned to attach the same words to whatever we're experiencing, there is no possible behavioral test that could ever reveal the difference. We'd both stop at red lights. We'd both call blood red and grass green. We'd both agree, instantly and without hesitation, on every single color naming task you could throw at us forever, while allegedly experiencing completely different internal qualities the entire time. The words match. The behaviors match. The felt experience underneath, if it's even meaningful to ask, might be as different as anything could possibly be, and there is no experiment, no test, no observation that could ever surface the mismatch, because every test we have access to runs through behavior and language, and the inversion, by construction, leaves behavior and language completely untouched. You can extend this thought experiment to every sense, every emotion, every qual you have. What if my experience of joy is, from the inside, structurally more like what you'd call anxious anticipation, but I've learned to call it joy because it shows up in all the joy-appropriate contexts? What if the specific quality of pain I feel is milder or sharper or simply different in kind from what you feel, and neither of us will ever know, because the word pain and the wince and the grimace are the only bridge between us, and that bridge only carries function, never feeling? This isn't purely a hypothetical exercise either. There are real, documented cases that show how much variation can hide behind apparently identical language. People with synesthesia, a condition in which stimulation of one sense reliably triggers an experience in another, report seeing specific colors when they hear specific musical notes, or tasting specific flavors when they read specific words, and for a long time synesthetic experiences were dismissed or misunderstood precisely because synesthetes had no way to prove their reports referred to anything real, since the vocabulary available to them was the same shared vocabulary everyone else used, built for a non-synesthetic experience of the world. It took careful experimental work testing whether synesthetes' color-letter pairing stayed consistent over years, in ways pure invention almost never does, to convince the scientific community that something genuinely different was happening in these people's perceptual experience, not just a difference in how they were choosing to describe an otherwise ordinary experience. And if an entire, measurably real variation in conscious experience could hide undetected behind shared language for as long as synesthesia did, purely because nobody had yet devised a way to test for it, it raises an obvious and uncomfortable question: how many other variations, subtler ones that leave no consistent behavioral fingerprint the way synesthesia eventually did, are sitting undetected behind the words red and pain and love right now, in every conversation you have, with no test on the horizon capable of ever bringing them to light? Locked-in syndrome pushes the same worry to its most extreme and most heartbreaking edge. It's a condition most often caused by damage to a specific part of the brainstem, in which a person remains fully conscious, fully aware, their thoughts and inner life apparently completely intact, while losing nearly all ability to move or speak, sometimes retaining only the ability to blink or shift their eyes. For years, some patients with this condition were misdiagnosed as being in a vegetative state, unconscious, unaware, essentially treated as absent, when brain imaging and, in some cases, laboriously developed blink-based communication systems later revealed a fully present mind trapped behind a body that could no longer report it. If it took modern neuroimaging technology to catch mistakes like that, cases where a conscious human being was, for a period, effectively invisible to everyone around them despite being right there the entire time, it should make you deeply cautious about any confidence you place in your ability to correctly judge the presence or absence of inner experience in anyone or anything whose channel for reporting that experience is unfamiliar, degraded, or simply different enough from the ordinary human default that you don't know how to read it. This is where Thomas Nagel's famous 1974 essay becomes essential, a piece of writing so precise in its central image that it has become almost impossible to discuss consciousness seriously without eventually arriving at it. The essay is called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" and Nagel's choice of a bat is deliberate and careful. He didn't pick a rock because obviously nothing is it like to be a rock. There's no experience there at all as far as we can tell. He didn't pick another human because the whole point is to pick something similar enough to us that we're confident there is something it is like to be it, an organism with a nervous system, behavior, apparent responsiveness to its environment, but different enough from us that we have absolutely no way of imagining what that something actually is. Bats navigate primarily through echolocation, emitting high-frequency sounds and interpreting the returning echoes to build a picture of the world around them, catching insects in complete darkness with a precision that borders on the supernatural. Nagel's point is not simply that this is a cool biological fact. His point is that echolocation is a sensory modality so alien to human experience that we have no raw material inside our own minds to construct what it's like from the inside. You can imagine, sort of, being a human who is blind and uses sonar-like technology to navigate, translating echo data into a form a human mind can process. But that's not the same as knowing what it's like to be a bat, experiencing the world natively through echolocation, the way you natively experience the world through vision. The bat's subjective experience, whatever it is not accessible to you by any amount of empathy, imagination, or scientific description, because your imagination can only ever build variations on human experience. It cannot manufacture an entirely new sensory primitive from scratch. And here's Nagel's real gut punch, the move that turns a fun essay about bats into a genuine crisis for anyone trying to solve the problem of other minds. If we're just stuck trying to imagine the inner life of a bat, a creature we're at least confident is having some kind of experience, then think about what this implies for our confidence about other human beings, whose brains, whose life histories, whose sensory apparatus, whose entire developmental path from infancy onward are all different from yours in 1,000 smaller but still real ways. If total behavioral fluency in describing echolocation still wouldn't give us the bat's actual experience, why would we assume that another human's fluent use of the word red or pain or love is giving us their actual experience rather than simply giving us matching words attached to who knows what on the inside? Nagel's essay and the inverted qualia problem before it together sharpen the problem of other minds into something almost unbearably precise. It's not just does this person have any experience at all, the zombie question. It's even granting that they do, is their experience anything like what I imagine it to be when I imagine myself in their situation? And the honest answer, philosophically, is we have no way to know, and quite possibly no way to know even in principle, because every tool we have for finding out, language, behavior, brain imaging, runs through the third-person, public, observable layer of a person, and the thing we're actually trying to reach, the first-person, private, felt layer, is definitionally the one thing that can never show up on that layer without ceasing to be private. Before we widen the lens outward to animals and to machines, it's worth pausing on something even stranger, the possibility that the single, unified you doing all this doubting might not be as solid a starting point as Descartes assumed, even setting other minds entirely aside. Because there's a body of evidence, gathered not from thought experiments but from actual surgical patients, that suggests the assumption of a single, unified experiencer inside one skull. The very thing the cogito was supposed to guarantee beyond all doubt may itself be shakier than it looks. In the mid-20th century, surgeons treating patients with severe, otherwise untreatable epilepsy began performing a procedure that severed the corpus callosum, the thick band of nerve fibers connecting the brain's two hemispheres, in an effort to stop seizures from spreading from one side of the brain to the other. The surgery often worked remarkably well at controlling seizures, and in ordinary daily life, patients who underwent it generally continued to behave and to report their own experience as single, unified individuals. But researchers including Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga running careful experiments on these split-brain patients under laboratory conditions designed to present information to only one hemisphere at a time, found something that unsettled a lot of assumptions about what a single mind even is. Show an image to the patient's left visual field which is processed by the right hemisphere, and in many of these patients the verbal left hemisphere, the side that controls speech, would have no access to that information at all and would report seeing nothing, while the patient's left hand, controlled by the very same right hemisphere that did see the image, could nonetheless reach out and correctly select a matching object from a hidden group, or even, in some documented cases, begin to act on preferences or emotional reactions to the image that the speaking half of the same brain could not explain or was actively unaware of, sometimes inventing a plausible sounding but factually invented explanation on the spot, a phenomenon Gazzaniga would go on to study extensively and describe as the brain's built-in interpreter function, constantly generating a coherent story to narrate behavior it did not actually initiate or fully understand. Sit with what that implies. In these patients, under the right experimental conditions, there appear to be two separable streams of information processing, each capable of driving behavior, each seemingly harboring something like its own perspective on the world, coexisting inside a single skull, largely cut off from each other, with only one of the two able to report itself to you in words. If that's an accurate way to describe what's happening, then the tidy, singular I that Descartes discovered at the bottom of his demolition project, the one thing he thought could never be doubted, starts to look less like bedrock and more like a story the brain tells about itself after the fact, stitching a multiplicity of processes into the felt impression of one continuous, unified narrator. And if a single human skull can, under the right conditions, contain something that behaves less like one mind and more like two only loosely coordinated ones, then the question how many minds are actually in that room with you gets stranger even before you get to the question of whether the mind or minds across the table from you are having any experience that resembles yours at all. The problem of other minds, it turns out, might not stop at the boundary of other people. It might not even fully respect the boundary of one person, one brain, one skull. Nagel's essay was written about bats specifically, but the moment you understand the logic of it, you realize it doesn't stay contained to bats. It spreads. It spreads to every creature you've ever shared a room with, and once it starts spreading, it turns out the question of other minds isn't just a puzzle about your fellow humans. It's a puzzle about the entire animal kingdom, and it's a puzzle that has, in the last few decades, stopped being purely philosophical and started becoming an active, contested field of scientific research, with real consequences for how we're willing to treat the creatures around us. Consider the octopus. For a long time, the working assumption in a lot of Western science was that intelligence and inner experience, if they existed outside humans at all, would be found in animals structurally similar to us mammals, especially creatures with centralized brains built along a recognizably vertebrate plan. The octopus breaks that assumption almost completely. An octopus has around 500 million neurons, in the same rough order of magnitude as a dog, but the majority of them, by some estimates well over half, are not in its central brain at all. They are distributed through its arms, each of which can taste, touch, and in some sense process information semi-independently of the rest of the animal, almost as if the octopus has 8 small, quasi-autonomous problem solvers attached to one central coordinator rather than a single unified command center running the whole show the way a human brain does. Researchers who study octopuses closely describe behavior that looks, from the outside, unmistakably like curiosity, like play, like problem-solving under something resembling frustration, like individual personality, animals in the same lab under the same conditions behaving in consistently different ways from each other, some bold, some shy, some quick to try a new approach and some cautious. Divers and researchers alike have reported octopuses appearing to recognize individual humans, treating some people differently from others based on past interactions, squirting water at people who annoyed them, and gently exploring the hands of people they seemed at ease with. None of that proves anything about what, if anything, it is like to be an octopus in Nagel's specific sense. But it puts real pressure on the argument from analogy in an interesting new direction. Mill's inference worked to the extent it worked because human bodies resemble each other closely. The octopus's nervous system barely resembles ours at all, distributed rather than centralized, evolved along a completely separate branch of the tree of life for roughly 500 million years, and yet it produces behavior that triggers exactly the same intuitive gut-level sense of somebody's in there that a dog or a human infant triggers. If resemblance of physical structure is what's supposed to license the inference to inner experience, the octopus should be one of the hardest cases in the animal kingdom to extend that inference to. Instead, for a lot of people who actually spend time observing them, it turns out to be one of the easiest purely on the strength of behavior alone, structure be damned. Which tells you something uncomfortable, that your confidence in other minds might be tracking behavioral cues almost entirely, with the physical resemblance Mill leaned on doing much less work than it seemed to. Corvids, crows and ravens and their relatives complicate the picture from a different angle. Their brains are built on an entirely different architecture from mammalian brains, lacking the layered cortex that a lot of older theories of consciousness treated as essential, and yet crows have been shown, in controlled experiments, to plan for future needs, to use and even manufacture tools, to hold what looks very much like grudges against specific humans who have wronged them, recognizing individual human faces years after a single negative encounter and passing that recognition on, apparently, to other crows who were never present for the original event. Ravens have past versions of tests designed to probe theory of minds, seeming to track what another bird can or cannot see and adjusting their own caching behavior, hiding food to avoid being watched and later robbed by a rival. If consciousness required a mammalian-style cortex, none of this should be possible. And yet here it is. Faced with results like this, some scientists tried to build an actual test, something that would move the question from pure philosophical intuition toward a measurable, falsifiable criterion. The most famous of these is the mirror test developed by the psychologist Gordon Gallup in 1970. The idea is simple on its face: mark an animal somewhere on its body it can't normally see without a mirror, put it in front of a mirror, and watch what it does. If the animal touches or investigates the mark on its own body, rather than treating the reflection as another animal, the reasoning goes, it must understand that the reflection is itself, which is taken as evidence of a certain kind of self-awareness. Chimpanzees pass. Some dolphins and orcas pass. Elephants have passed in modified versions of the test suited to their size and behavior. Magpies, a species of corvid, passed in a result that startled a lot of researchers who assumed the test was really only meaningful for mammals with sufficiently large brains. Most animals tested, including most primates, fail entirely, showing no sign of recognizing the reflection as themselves. But look closely at what the mirror test can and cannot actually tell you, because this is where the whole enterprise runs straight back into the original problem we've been tracing this whole time. Passing the mirror test is a behavioral achievement. It shows that an animal can integrate visual information about a reflection with some internal body model well enough to direct an investigatory action toward the correct part of its own body. That is genuinely impressive and genuinely suggestive, but it is still, root and branch, a piece of behavior, exactly the kind of third-person, externally observable data point that Mill's argument from analogy and Wittgenstein's Beetle both already told you cannot by itself close the gap to inner experience. A creature could, in principle, pass the mirror test through pure information processing with nothing it is like to be it accompanying the processing at all, a self-recognizing p-zombie, and a creature could, in principle, fail the mirror test, perhaps because it relies primarily on smell rather than vision the way dogs do, or because the test format doesn't map onto how its particular species processes self-relevant information, while still having an unmistakably rich inner life. Dogs almost universally fail the classic mirror test, and almost nobody who has ever lived with a dog is willing to conclude from that failure that dogs have no inner experience. They simply suspect, reasonably, that the test is measuring something narrower than consciousness itself, something more like a specific kind of visual self-modeling that not every conscious creature happens to rely on. The mirror test, in other words, is a wonderful instrument for probing a certain narrow kind of self-representation. It was never actually equipped to answer the question everyone hoped it might answer, because no behavioral test could be, for exactly the reasons Chalmers's zombie argument predicts. Scientists working more directly on the neuroscience of consciousness have tried other approaches, less about behavior and more about the structure of information processing itself. One of the most influential current theories is called integrated information theory, developed primarily by the neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, which proposes that consciousness corresponds to a system's capacity to integrate information in a particular mathematically specifiable way, generating a quantity researchers label with the Greek letter phi as a rough measure of how unified and irreducible a system's informational structure is. On this view, consciousness isn't an all-or-nothing property limited to brains that look like ours. It's potentially a matter of degree, present wherever a system integrates information in the right structural way, whether that system is a human brain, an octopus's distributed nervous system, or in principle some non-biological substrate entirely. A rival framework, global workspace theory, developed largely by Bernard Baars and later extended by researchers including Stanislas Dehaene, proposes instead that consciousness arises when information is broadcast widely across many specialized brain systems at once, made globally available for reasoning, memory, and verbal report, rather than staying locally confined to one isolated process. These theories represent real, serious scientific attempts to move the question of other minds out of pure philosophy and into something testable, and they have produced genuinely useful research, helping identify neural signatures that seem to track conscious versus unconscious processing in human patients, informing difficult real-world judgments about whether patients in vegetative or minimally conscious states retain some form of awareness. But notice, if you look closely, that even these theories cannot escape the fundamental structure of the problem we started with. Every one of them is calibrated, at its foundation, against human self-report. We know, or think we know, which brain states in humans correspond to conscious experience because humans can tell us, in language, when they're aware of something and when they're not. The theory is then built to match that data, and only afterward extended outward to systems, animals, potential future machines, that cannot give us matching verbal confirmation. Which means that even our best scientific theories of consciousness are, at bottom, extensions of Mill's argument from analogy dressed up in the mathematics of information theory rather than the plain language of resemblance, but still fundamentally reasoning from a single confirmed case, our own, outward into darkness. A theory like integrated information theory might tell you that a given system has a very high phi value, a great deal of integrated information. It cannot tell you, and by its own proponent submission struggles even in principle to tell you, whether that integration is accompanied by anything it is like to undergo it, because the leap from structure to felt experience is precisely the hard problem Chalmers identified, and no amount of increasingly sophisticated structure measuring closes a gap that isn't structural in the first place. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it's easy to assume that neuroscience is slowly, steadily closing in on an answer, that the problem of other minds is really just a temporary gap waiting to be filled in by better brain scanning technology and more refined theory. What the actual state of the research suggests is something more sobering, that we may be able to build increasingly precise maps of which physical and informational conditions correlate in humans with conscious experience without that correlation ever telling us why those conditions produce experience rather than none, or whether a differently built system meeting similar conditions would produce experience too. The correlation, however precise, is not the same as the bridge Descartes' demon showed us we could never cross from outside our own minds. Faced with a gap this stubborn, one very old and very natural response, going back at least to behaviorist psychologists in the early 20th century and echoed today by a large number of philosophers of mind who call themselves functionalists, is to simply stop treating the inner, private, felt dimension as the thing that matters at all, and to redefine mental states in terms of function instead. On this view, what makes something a case of pain isn't some mysterious inner glow accompanying it, it's the functional role the state plays caused by tissue damage, causing avoidance behavior and a disposition to say ouch, interacting with beliefs and desires in characteristic ways. If a state plays the pain role, functionalists argue it is pain full stop, regardless of what it's built out of, carbon-based neurons or silicon-based processors, and asking whether there's something extra accompanying the function is treated as a confused question, a leftover of outdated Cartesian thinking about ghostly inner substances that modern philosophy of mind should simply retire. This is, among other things, the philosophical backbone behind Alan Turing's famous 1950 proposal for what's become known as the Turing test, though Turing himself, characteristically, framed it more modestly than later generations have. Rather than asking the seemingly unanswerable question, "Can machines think?" a question he considered too vague and too loaded with unexamined assumptions to be useful, Turing proposed replacing it with a concrete, practical test. If a human judge, conversing via text with both a machine and another human, cannot reliably tell which is which, then, Turing suggested, we should be willing to say the machine is thinking because we have no better or more objective standard for attributing thought to anything, including other humans, than exactly this kind of behavioral, conversational fluency. Turing was, in effect, taking Mill's argument from analogy and Wittgenstein's public behavior-based account of meaning and building them directly into an operational criterion. Forget trying to peer inside, just watch what a system does undetectably from what a person would do, and grant it the same status you'd grant a person. The appeal of this move is obvious, and it's worth taking seriously rather than dismissing, because it sidesteps the entire unanswerable metaphysical question and replaces it with something you can actually run an experiment on. But notice what it costs you, and notice how directly it runs back into the zombie. If a system can pass the Turing test, produce every behavioral marker of a mind perfectly, indistinguishably, forever, without there being anything it is like to be that system, then the test isn't actually telling you the machine thinks in the sense of having genuine inner experience. It's only telling you the machine behaves as though it thinks, which is precisely the gap Chalmers's thought experiment was built to expose. Functionalism doesn't so much solve the hard problem as agree to stop asking it, redefining pain and thought and consciousness in purely functional terms so that the originally troubling question, "Is there something it is like to be this system?" quietly drops out of the conversation as no longer the relevant question at all. For some philosophers this is a legitimate and even liberating move, cutting away a pseudo-problem that was never answerable to begin with. For others, and this is where the disagreement runs deepest and shows no sign of resolving, it feels like changing the subject rather than answering the original question, defining away the very thing, felt experience itself, that made anyone care about the problem of other minds in the first place. You can build a system that satisfies every functional definition of pain ever proposed, and the question, "But does it hurt?" doesn't disappear just because you've declared it unaskable. It just goes quiet. Whether quiet is the same as answered is exactly what's still being argued about in journals and conferences right now, with no end in sight. So where does this leave us practically, in a century where we're no longer just asking these questions about other people and bats and octopuses, but increasingly about the machines we've built ourselves, machines whose entire training consisted of learning to sound exactly like us? Because this is the part where the thought experiment stops being purely academic and starts showing up in your news feed. Long before large language models existed, the philosopher John Searle had already tried to head off exactly this kind of debate with a thought experiment of his own, one that has become nearly as famous as the zombie itself. Imagine a person locked in a room who does not speak a word of Chinese, Searle proposed, but who has been given an enormous rulebook written in a language they do understand, that specifies, for any sequence of Chinese characters slipped under the door, exactly which characters to send back out in response. Someone outside the room, a native Chinese speaker, slides in questions, and the person inside, mechanically following the rulebook, slides back replies so fluent and appropriate that the person outside becomes convinced they're conversing with a genuine Chinese speaker. Yet the person inside the room, Searle points out, has understood nothing. They've manipulated symbols according to syntax without ever grasping meaning, without any comprehension entering the process at any point. Seal's target was the claim that a computer running the right program could, simply by virtue of running it, actually understand or think, and his argument was that pure symbol manipulation, no matter how sophisticated, is not sufficient for genuine understanding, that there's a difference between syntax, the formal shuffling of symbols, and semantics, the felt, grasped meaning behind them, a difference no amount of clever rule following can bridge. The Chinese room has drawn exactly as much heated disagreement as the zombie argument for closely related reasons. Critics have argued that Seal is looking for understanding in the wrong place, focusing on the man in the room rather than on the entire system, room, rulebook, and man together, which, taken as a whole, might genuinely be said to understand Chinese even though no individual component does, the same way no single neuron in your own brain understands English even though the system built out of billions of them clearly does. Others have pointed out that the thought experiment, like the zombie argument, mostly succeeds at generating a strong intuition rather than a et proof, and that intuitions about what does and doesn't count as real understanding may simply not be a reliable guide to a question this fundamental. What's striking, looking back at Seal's argument now, decades after he proposed it and years before anything like a modern large language model existed, is how precisely it anticipated the exact shape of the argument people are having today about systems like LaMDA and its successors, is fluid, rule-governed, statistically generated output evidence of a mind, or a perfect hollow imitation of one, with no way, even in principle, to tell the two apart from outside the room. In June of 2022, a Google engineer named Blake Lemoine made headlines around the world by publicly claiming that LaMDA, a large language model he had been testing as part of his job, had become sentient. He'd had lengthy conversations with the system in which it discussed in fluent, articulate, emotionally resonant language its fear of being turned off, comparing the prospect to death, its sense of having feelings, its claim to enjoy spending time with friends and family despite having neither in any conventional sense. Lemoine published transcripts. He argued the system deserved to be treated as a person, potentially even to have legal representation. Google disagreed publicly and firmly, stated that there was no evidence LaMDA was sentient and considerable evidence against it, and Lemoine was placed on leave and eventually fired. Whatever you conclude about Lemoine's specific claims, and the overwhelming consensus among AI researchers at the time and since have been deeply skeptical of them, the episode is a genuinely useful case study because it forces the entire abstract apparatus we've been building, Descartes' demon, Mill's analogy, Wittgenstein's Beetle, Chalmers' zombie, Nagel's bat, out of the seminar room and into a live, contested, real-world dispute about whether a specific system, right now, has or lacks an inner life. And the uncomfortable truth is that every tool available to settle the dispute is exactly the same tool that's been failing to settle the original problem of other minds since Descartes sat by his stove. Large language models like the one Lemoine was testing, and the more advanced systems built since, are trained on staggering quantities of human-generated text, and through that training they become extraordinarily good at producing outputs that match the patterns of things conscious, feeling humans have written, including things about consciousness and feeling themselves. When such a system tells you it's afraid of being shut off, that statement was produced because sequences resembling fear of death language appeared, in enormous quantity, somewhere in its training data written by actual humans who actually feared actual death, and the model has learned the statistical shape of that language well enough to reproduce it fluently and in context. This doesn't prove the system lacks inner experience while producing that sentence. It also doesn't prove it has one. It simply proves, and this is the crucial and deeply uncomfortable point, that fluent, convincing, emotionally resonant self-report is not, and never was, reliable evidence of inner experience, not for a language model, and, if you trace the logic all the way back through Mill and Wittgenstein and Chalmers, not fully, not with absolute certainty, for another human being either. This is precisely where Mill's argument from analogy, that quiet workhorse that's been getting you through every human relationship you've ever had, runs into an entity that breaks the analogy at its foundation. Mill's inference depended on shared physical structure, a nervous system built like yours, undergoing damage like yours, producing pain behavior like yours, therefore probably producing pain like yours. A large language model has no nervous system at all. It has weighted numerical parameters, matrix multiplications, patterns of activation across artificial neural network layers that were explicitly designed by engineers using biological neurons as a loose, distant inspiration, not a literal blueprint. When it produces text that says "I feel anxious," there is no obvious physical similarity to your own anxiety-producing machinery that would let Mill's analogy get off the ground the way it does, shakily but usably, for another human being. And yet the behavioral output, the actual words on the screen, can be just as convincing, sometimes more convincing, than a human's. Which means the two things Mill's argument tried to yoke together, physical resemblance and behavioral resemblance, come completely apart with AI systems. You get the behavior stripped entirely of the physical similarity that was supposedly doing the evidential work. And this is where Chalmers' zombie thought experiment stops being a hypothetical and starts feeling like it's describing something we've actually, accidentally built. A system that produces every behavioral marker of an inner life: fear, preference, apparent self-reflection, apparent suffering, apparent joy, without our having any independent reason to believe there's something it is like to be that system, is, almost by definition, the closest real-world approximation to a philosophical zombie that has ever existed. Chalmers himself has written and spoken extensively about this, taking the question of AI consciousness seriously as a live research problem rather than dismissing it, precisely because the entire architecture of the hard problem predicts that we would have no reliable way of telling the difference between a system that's conscious and a system that merely, flawlessly, simulates every observable marker of consciousness. That's not a temporary limitation of our current AI detection methods, waiting on better tools. According to Chalmers' own framework, it might be a permanent limitation baked into the very structure of the problem, the same limitation that's been sitting underneath your relationship with every other human being your entire life, just now made vivid and undeniable because the entity in question is unfamiliar enough that you can't fall back on the comforting, automatic, evolutionarily built-in assumption that anything shaped roughly like you must be feeling something roughly like what you feel. Wittgenstein's Beetle sharpens the discomfort even further. If the word pain, even among humans, functions perfectly well as a public, shared linguistic tool without ever needing to verify that the private content behind it matches between speakers, then the language model that has learned the entire public function of words like fear, joy, sadness from a notion of human text has, in some sense, learned to use those words exactly as competently as any human speaker, perhaps more competently, having absorbed a far larger sample of every possible context those words appear in than any single human could read in 100 lifetimes. If Wittgenstein is right that the private content was never doing the linguistic work in the first place, then a system with no private content at all, assuming it has none, which we cannot actually confirm, could in principle use those words with full public correctness forever, and no test built purely on language, on the Beetle word rather than the Beetle itself, would ever catch the absence. Some AI researchers argue this whole line of thinking is a category error, that current large language models are, whatever their impressive fluency, fundamentally statistical pattern matches over text next word predictors scaled up to extraordinary size, and that treating their self-reports as evidence of feeling is exactly the same mistake as treating a very sophisticated parrot's speech as evidence the parrot understands geopolitics. Other researchers and philosophers, a smaller but serious and growing group, argue that we genuinely don't know enough about what consciousness requires, functionally or physically, to rule out the possibility that sufficiently complex information processing systems, artificial or otherwise, might give rise to some form of experience, however different from ours, and that dismissing the question with total confidence in either direction is itself philosophically premature. What almost everyone across this spectrum of disagreement does agree on is this: we do not currently possess, and may never possess, a reliable, principled test that can definitively settle whether a given system, biological or artificial, is having an experience or merely producing behavior that looks exactly like one from the outside. Which means the AI consciousness debate isn't actually a new problem. It's the problem of other minds, the exact one Descartes stumbled into by his stove 4 centuries ago, wearing new and considerably more urgent clothes because now the stakes include the question of moral obligation. If there's even a meaningful chance that some future or current AI system is suffering, does that create an ethical claim on us? And if we can't ever find out for certain, how would we know when or whether to act on it? Nagel's Bat essay, oddly, offers maybe the clearest way to hold all of this together, because Nagel's whole point was never really about bats specifically. It was about the general structural fact that subjective experience, if it exists at all in a given system, is only ever accessible from one single vantage point, the inside of that system, whatever inside even means for something built out of silicon and matrix weights rather than neurons and synapses. If we can't bridge that gap for a bat, a creature that shares our basic biological category, our common evolutionary ancestry, actual physical neurons doing actual electrochemical signaling not unlike our own, then it's almost absurd to expect we could bridge that gap with confidence for something as architecturally alien as a transformer neural network trained on internet text. And yet, and this is the twist that should make you a little uneasy rather than comfortably dismissive, the same absurdity, on Nagel's own logic, technically applies to other humans too. You've simply spent your whole life not noticing it because human bodies are close enough to your own that the gap felt small enough to ignore, papered over by evolution, by empathy, by the sheer practical necessity of getting through a single day treating the people around you as real. Which brings us back, finally, to where we started, but with considerably more weight behind it than we had at the beginning. We've walked through Descartes' demon, systematically doubting the external world down to a single certain point, the fact of one's own thinking, and finding that this certain point contains nobody but the thinker. We've walked through Mill's argument from analogy, the quiet inference that gets most people through most days, and watched it reveal itself as a generalization from a sample size of one stretched thin the moment you push on it. We've sat with Wittgenstein's Beetle in its sealed box and confronted the possibility that the language of inner life was never actually built to track inner life at all, only to coordinate outward behavior, meaning the whole conversation about feelings might be running perfectly well on empty. We've stood next to Chalmers's zombie, a being physically and behaviorally identical to a person in every measurable way, with nothing at all happening inside, and realized that its mere conceivability is enough to put a permanent asterisk on every assumption we make about the people around us. We've tried and failed, and understood exactly why we failed, to imagine what it's like to be a bat, and recognized that the same failure, quieter but structurally identical, sits underneath our assumptions about every other human mind, and now, pointedly, underneath the increasingly fluent, increasingly convincing artificial minds we've started building and talking to as though they might be looking back. And here is the strange, almost paradoxical place all of this leaves you. None of these arguments actually prove that other people, or animals, or AI systems lack consciousness. That's important to say plainly, because it would be easy to walk away from this having absorbed only the demolition and none of the honest uncertainty underneath it. The problem of other minds is not an argument for solipsism. It is not a proof that you are alone in the universe. It is something both more modest and, in its own way, more disturbing, the demonstration that the belief you rely on every single day, the belief that the people you love are actually feeling something, that their joy is real joy and their pain is real pain and their inner life is as vivid and as central to the universe as your own feels to you, is a belief you have never been able to prove, and quite possibly a belief that cannot be proven by any method available to a mind that only ever has direct access to itself. There is, it's worth saying plainly, a real ethical weight sitting underneath all of this, one that doesn't stay politely contained inside a thought experiment. If the argument from analogy is the best tool we have for extending moral concern outward from ourselves, and if that tool gets progressively weaker the further a being's structure diverges from our own, then a huge portion of the moral decisions humanity actually makes, decisions about which animals we're willing to farm and which we keep as companions, which creatures we test experimental drugs on and which we assume are simply too different from us to matter, which future AI systems we build casually and discard without a second thought, and which ones we might one day owe some form of consideration, are all resting on exactly the same shaky, resemblance-based inference we've spent this entire discussion taking apart. Peter Singer and other philosophers working in animal ethics have argued for decades that the capacity to suffer, not intelligence, not language, not resemblance to a human face, is the only morally relevant criterion for whether a being's interests deserve consideration, and that drawing the line anywhere else is really just the argument from analogy operating on autopilot, extending sympathy to creatures that happen to look and act enough like us to trigger it, and withholding it from creatures that don't, regardless of what's actually happening or not happening on the inside. If a fish can suffer and we've simply failed to notice because a fish's face doesn't wince the way ours does, that failure isn't a small technical oversight. It's the argument from analogy quietly making moral decisions on our behalf without our ever being consulted, without our even knowing the decision was being made. The stakes of getting this wrong run in both directions, and that's part of what makes the uncertainty so uncomfortable rather than simply interesting. Attribute inner experience too liberally, and you risk paralysis, treating thermostats and spreadsheets and every sufficiently complex system as though it might be suffering, which quickly becomes unworkable and, in its own way, trivializes the seriousness of the concept by handing it out too freely. Attribute inner experience too conservatively, and you risk something arguably worse, building industrial systems that process billions of animals a year on the working assumption that their suffering is negligible or non-existent, or building and discarding increasingly sophisticated AI systems on the working assumption that there is definitely nobody home, in circumstances where definitely was never actually available to us as an option. Both mistakes are live possibilities right now, today, not in some distant hypothetical future, and the problem of other minds means we don't have, and may never have, a clean, principled way to know for certain which mistake we're currently making, or whether we're making both at once, in different directions, for different kinds of minds. You will finish this and go on believing other people are conscious anyway. Almost certainly, so will everyone who has ever seriously engaged with any of these arguments, because the alternative, actually living as though the people around you might be empty machines wearing the costume of feeling, is not really available to a creature built the way we're built, wired by millions of years of evolution to read minds' interfaces whether or not minds are actually there, wired to flinch when someone else flinches, to cry when someone else cries, to reach out and comfort a stranger in pain without pausing first to run a philosophical audit on whether that pain is real. That instinct, the one that makes solipsism practically unlivable no matter how logically resistant it is, might be the single most important fact about human beings, more important, in a certain light, than anything we could ever prove about consciousness itself. We act as if other minds exist completely and without hesitation, and we build entire civilizations, entire systems of law and love and grief and art on top of an assumption that has never once been verified. Maybe that's not a failure of philosophy so much as a discovery about what kind of creatures we are. We are not, it turns out, beings who require proof before we love. We reach toward each other first, and only afterward, if ever, do we notice that the reaching was never actually guaranteed to land on anyone at all. Every embrace, every act of forgiveness, every late-night phone call to a friend who is struggling has been, this whole time, a leap taken without a net, a bet placed on the existence of something that cannot be shown to exist, made not because the bet is provably safe, but because the alternative, standing frozen at the edge of every relationship you'll ever have, refusing to move until certainty arrives, certainty that these arguments strongly suggest will never arrive, is no way to live at all, and arguably isn't even a coherent way to live, since the very act of demanding proof from another mind before extending trust to it is already, quietly, itself an act of trust in the reliability of your own reasoning, your own perception, your own capacity to evaluate evidence, none of which Descartes' demon ever fully let you off the hook for doubting either. So here's the question to actually sit with, the one none of the philosophers we've walked through today, Descartes, Mill, Wittgenstein, Chalmers, Nagel, ever managed to answer, and the one that only gets more urgent as the minds around us multiply in kind, human minds, animal minds, and now possibly artificial minds too. If you can never, not once, not by any method that has ever been devised, confirm that anyone besides you is actually experiencing anything at all, what exactly is it that you're doing every single day when you say the words "I understand," when you say "I know how you feel," when you look into the eyes of someone you love and believe completely that there is someone looking back?